The afternoon was quiet, and the warm sun peeked through the cracks of Baba Arlau's small wooden house. Inside, the old man sat in his favorite chair by the window, his wrinkled hands resting on his knees. The radio hummed softly in the corner, playing an old song he loved. Everything seemed peaceful. But suddenly, the door burst open with a loud bang. Igbo stormed in, her footsteps pounding like thunder on the wooden floor. She looked like a storm herself, her face red with anger, her eyes burning with tears. Baba Arlau jumped in his chair, startled by the noise. "Baba Arlau!" Igbo shouted, her voice shaking but strong. She stood tall, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "What have you done to my daughter?" The old man blinked, confused and surprised. "Igbo," he said, his voice unsteady. "What is this about?" "What daughter?" Igbo's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She pointed a finger at him, her hand trembling. "Dami, my little girl. She's pregnant. 12 years old, and she's pregnant." Her words cut through the air like a knife. Baba Arlau's face changed. First, he looked shocked, then angry. He leaned forward in his chair, gripping the arms tightly. "Igbo, how dare you accuse me of something like this? Me, your husband's father?" But Igbo wasn't backing down. Her voice grew louder, her tears now streaming down her cheeks. "You think I don't know? You told her lies about rituals to make her taller. You took advantage of her innocence." At the door stood Dami, holding on to the wooden frame as if it was the only thing keeping her from falling. She looked so small, her thin body trembling, her face pale. Her big eyes were red and puffy from crying. She didn't say a word, but her presence made the room feel heavier. Igbo turned to her daughter, her voice softening for a moment. "Dami, my child, tell me the truth. Don't be afraid. Mama is here." Dami wiped her tears with her small hands. Her voice was shaky as she spoke. "Grandpa," he said, "it was to make me taller. He said it was a blessing." Igbo gasped, her legs giving way as she dropped to her knees. She pulled Dami into her arms, holding her tightly. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. From the back of the house, Kunal, Dami's older brother, came rushing in. His footsteps were loud, and his face was full of anger. He was tall and strong, and his fists were clenched tightly by his sides. "How could you do this, Baba Arlau?" Kunal shouted, his deep voice echoing in the small room. His eyes burned with rage as he stepped closer to the old man. Baba Arlau shrank back in his chair, looking smaller than ever. "Igbo, Kunal, I didn't do anything. The girl is lying," he stammered, his voice trembling. But Kunal didn't care. He moved forward, his fists shaking as if he was ready to hit Baba Arlau. "You hurt my sister," he yelled. Igbo jumped up and grabbed Kunal by the arms, holding him back with all her strength. "Kunal, no," she cried. "This is not the way. We will let the elders handle this. They will bring justice." Kunal stopped, his chest heaving with anger. He gave Baba Arlau a hard look, his teeth clenched tightly. Then he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The room fell silent. The only sound was Dami's soft sobs as she buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Igbo held her tightly, her mind racing. She knew she had to do something to protect her daughter and make sure Baba Arlau faced the consequences of his actions. That evening, the village elders were called to Baba Arlau's house. They sat in the small room, their faces serious and their eyes stern. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering and murmuring about what had happened. Inside, Igbo stood tall, her voice steady as she told the elders everything she had learned. Dami stood by her side, clutching her mother's hand tightly. The elders listened carefully, their expressions growing darker with every word. When they asked Dami to speak, her small voice trembled, but she told them the truth. Her words were like drops of rain falling into a still pond, each one rippling through the room. Finally, The eldest of them, a tall man with a long beard, turned to Baba Arlau. "Do you deny these accusations?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Baba Arlau's lips quivered. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Finally, he whispered, I didn't mean for this to happen. I only wanted to help her." Gasps filled the room. The neighbors outside began to mutter loudly, their voices full of shock and anger. The elders shook their heads, their faces filled with disappointment. "This is not a mistake," Igbo said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is evil. He has ruined my child's life. He must face justice." The eldest elder nodded solemnly. "Igbo is right," he said. "This matter will not be ignored. Baba Arlau must answer for his actions." The next morning, the village gathered as Igbo and Kunal led Baba Arlau to the police station. The old man walked with his head bowed, his once proud posture now hunched with shame. People whispered as they passed, their faces filled with anger and sadness. As they reached the station, Igbo held Dami close, her heart heavy but her resolve strong. She whispered to her daughter, "We will get through this. I promise." And as the doors closed behind Baba Arlau, the village knew that justice would be served. But for Igbo and Dami, the journey was far from over. Igbo decided to take Dami far away from the pain and whispers of the village. She packed what little they had and took Dami and her growing belly to her own mother's house, in another village. It was a quiet place, surrounded by tall trees and fields of green, but life here was not easy. Their new home was a small, mud-walled house with a thatched roof that leaked whenever it rained. The floor was bare earth, cold underfoot. Dami had to sleep on a thin mat in the corner, her growing body aching every night. But the hardest part wasn't the discomfort, it was the hunger. Food was scarce, and Dami often went to bed with her stomach growling. Igbo did everything she could, but there was simply not enough. Dami's mornings started before the sun came up. She would wake to the sound of her grandmother calling her name, her voice firm but kind. "Dami, wake up. The water won't fetch itself." Dami would drag herself out of bed, her legs feeling heavy, and walk to the village well with a bucket in her hands. The path was long and rough, covered with stones that made her feet ache. By the time she reached the well, the line was already long with women and girls chattering as they waited their turn. When it was finally her turn, Dami would lower the bucket into the well, using all her strength to pull it back up, full of water. The bucket was heavy, and her arms would shake as she carried it back home, one slow step at a time. She spilled water on her feet as she walked, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Back home, there was always more work waiting. Dami swept the yard, washed clothes, and helped her grandmother cook meals. Sometimes, her swollen feet throbbed, and her back ached, but she didn't complain. She knew her mother and grandmother were doing their best, and she wanted to help. Even in the new village, the whispers found them. Some neighbors would stop and stare when they saw Dami's growing belly. "So young," they'd mutter. "What a shame. What kind of mother lets this happen?" Dami would pretend not to hear, but her heart felt heavy. She kept her head down, avoiding the eyes of the other children her age, who giggled and pointed whenever she walked past. Igbo heard the gossip too, but she stood tall, her chin raised. "They can talk," she told Dami one evening as they sat outside their house, watching the stars. "But they don't know how strong we are." Dami nodded, but inside, she felt like she was carrying a weight too heavy for her small shoulders. One night, as the crickets chirped outside, Dami woke with a sharp pain in her belly. It was stronger than anything she had ever felt before. She cried out, and Igbo rushed to her side. "The baby is coming," Igbo shouted, her voice full of both fear and determination. She called for help, and a neighbor brought a wooden cart to carry Dami to the small maternity home on the edge of the village. The room was dimly lit, and the bed was old and creaky. The midwife, an elderly woman with kind eyes and steady hands, told Dami to push. Dami screamed as the pain tore through her. She gripped her mother's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. But something was wrong. Blood started to pour, soaking the thin sheet beneath her. Iyabo's heart raced. "Do something," she cried to the midwife. The midwife worked quickly, sending her assistant to fetch an old woman known for her knowledge of herbs. The old woman arrived with a basket of leaves and roots. She crushed them into a paste and boiled a strange-smelling tea. "Drink this," she said firmly, holding the cup to Dami's lips. Dami obeyed, swallowing the bitter liquid. Slowly, the bleeding began to stop, and the room filled with the sound of a baby's first cry. Iyabo wept with relief as the midwife placed the tiny baby in Dami's trembling arms. She was small, with rosy cheeks and bright, curious eyes. Dami stared at her baby, her pain forgotten for a moment. "She's beautiful," Dami whispered, her voice weak but full of love. Iyabo smiled through her tears. "We will call her Junwo," she said. "It means beloved." The days after Junwo's birth were hard. Dami was weak, her body sore from the long and difficult delivery. But she held her baby close, watching her tiny fingers curl and uncurl. Junwo's cries woke her at night, but instead of feeling annoyed, Dami felt a deep sense of responsibility. She wanted to give her daughter a better life, no matter what it took. As she sat outside one morning, rocking Junwo in her arms, Dami looked at her mother. "Mema," she said softly, "I will do whatever it takes to take care of my baby. I promise." Iyabo placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "We will do it together," she said. "We are stronger than they think." Life was still full of challenges, but Dami and Iyabo had each other, and now, they had little Junwo, the bright light in their darkest days. Together, they began to dream of a better future, even as the road ahead remained uncertain. Life after Junwo's birth was a mix of joy and hardship. The tiny baby brought smiles to Dami's face, even on the toughest days. Her little hands would grab Dami's fingers, and her giggles lit up the small, dark house. But Dami knew smiles wouldn't feed her baby. She needed to find a way to help her mother and provide for Junwo. One afternoon, as Dami sat outside rocking Junwo to sleep, Iyabo came home with exciting news. She had met a kind seamstress in the village named Madam Bisi, who was willing to take Dami as an apprentice. "Dami," Iyabo said, sitting beside her, "this is your chance to learn something that can help you and your baby. Sewing is a good skill. You can make clothes for others and earn money." Dami looked at her mother, unsure at first. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make clothes, but Iyabo's encouraging smile gave her hope. "I'll do it, Mama," she said, her voice steady. "For Junwo." On her first day at Madam Bisi's shop, Dami felt nervous. The shop was small but colorful, with fabrics of all patterns and colors stacked neatly on the shelves. The hum of sewing machines filled the air as Madam Bisi and her apprentices worked busily. "Dami," Madam Bisi said with a warm smile, "you'll start with the basics. Threading needles, cutting fabric, and sewing simple lines. Take your time, and don't be afraid to ask questions." Dami nodded eagerly, determined to prove herself. Her first stitches were shaky, and her fingers fumbled with the needle, but she didn't give up. Madam Bisi watched her closely, giving gentle tips and encouraging her when she made mistakes. By the end of the week, Dami had mastered threading the needle and could sew a straight line. She was slow, but her work was neat. Madam Bisi patted her shoulder. "You're doing well, my dear," she said. "Keep practicing." Over the next few weeks, Dami spent every spare moment practicing her sewing. At home, after putting Junwo to sleep, she would light a small lamp and work on scraps of fabric Madam Bisi had given her. Her fingers moved quickly, and her stitches grew straighter and neater with each passing day. At the shop, her speed and skill improved so much that Madam Bisi trusted her with real orders. "Dami, finish this dress for me," she said one afternoon, handing Dami a half-sewn piece. The dress was for a village woman's daughter. Dami worked carefully, her hands steady, and when she finished, the dress was perfect. The customer was delighted. "Who made this?" she asked. When Madame Bisi pointed to Dami, the woman smiled. "You have a gift, young girl." Word began to spread. More people started coming to Madame Bisi's shop, asking for Dami to sew their clothes. The other apprentices noticed, and whispers began. "She thinks she's better than us," one said. "She's just lucky," another muttered. Dami heard their words, but she stayed focused. She wasn't sewing to impress anyone, she was sewing for Junwo. Meanwhile, Junwo was growing quickly. Her chubby cheeks and bright eyes made her the darling of the village. Whenever Dami brought her to the shop, customers would smile and pinch her cheeks. "She's such a happy baby," they'd say. Junwo's laughter filled Dami with strength. Whenever she felt tired or overwhelmed, one look at her daughter reminded her why she was working so hard. The baby's presence seemed to bring good luck to the family. People who once gossiped about Dami now stopped to greet her warmly. Some even brought small gifts for the baby, fruits, a blanket, or a tiny bracelet. Iyabo noticed the change too. One evening, as she watched Dami sew under the flickering light of the lamp, she said, "Junwo is our blessing, Dami. She's bringing hope back into our lives." Dami smiled, her heart full. "I'll do anything for her, Mama," she said. "I'll make sure she has a better life." One sunny afternoon, while Dami was busy stitching a dress at the shop, a stranger entered. He was tall, with dark skin and kind eyes. His clothes were neat and expensive, and he carried himself with confidence. The air in the shop seemed to change as he walked in. Madame Bisi greeted him with a deep bow. "Prince Femi," she said respectfully. Dami's hands froze mid-stitch. She had heard of Prince Femi, the king's fourth son, who had just returned from America. He was known for his intelligence and charm. "Why was he here?" "I heard you have a talented young seamstress," Prince Femi said, his deep voice filling the room. "I'd like to meet her." Madame Bisi turned to Dami and gestured for her to come forward. Nervously, Dami set down her sewing and stood up, holding her hands nervously in front of her. "This is Dami," Madame Bisi said. "She's one of my best apprentices." Prince Femi looked at her with a warm smile. "You're very hardworking," he said. "I've seen your stitches. They're precise and full of care. Your talent is remarkable." Dami blushed, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. The prince nodded and turned to Madame Bisi. "People like her are the backbone of our community. She deserves every opportunity to succeed." Before he left, Prince Femi spoke to Dami one last time. "Keep working hard," he said. "You have a bright future ahead of you." As the door closed behind him, the shop buzzed with excitement. The other apprentices whispered and giggled, but Dami sat quietly, her heart racing. She kept staring at the dress she was sewing, and a small smile on her lips. She didn't know where her hard work would lead her, but she knew one thing, she was ready for whatever came next. The sun rose gently over the village, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The roosters crowed, and the sound of the morning market drifted through the air. Inside their little house, Dami sat by the window, feeding baby Junwo. The baby giggled and reached for her mother's face, her tiny fingers tugging at Dami's cheek. Dami laughed softly, her heart full of love for her little girl. "Mama," Dami called to Iyabo, who was sweeping the yard outside. "Junwo just gave me the sweetest smile. I think she knows how much we love her." Iyabo peeked through the window, her broom in hand. "Of course, she knows," she said with a smile. "She's our little blessing." Later that afternoon, while Dami was busy sewing a dress, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up and gasped. It was Prince Femi. He was standing there, dressed in crisp, clean clothes, looking as confident as ever. "Good afternoon, Dami," he said, his voice calm but friendly. Dami quickly stood up, wiping her hands on her dress. "Good afternoon, Your Highness, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was nervous, but she tried to stay calm. Prince Femi walked into the house and sat down on the wooden chair near the window. Dami, I've been watching you, he began. Not in a bad way, he added quickly, seeing her startled look. I've noticed how hardworking you are. You're raising your daughter, helping your mother, and building a skill that will take you far. Dami blushed, unsure of what to say. Iyabo entered the room, her face full of curiosity, but she quickly bowed to the prince. Your Highness, welcome, she said, her voice respectful. Prince Femi smiled at Iyabo. Thank you, Mama Iyabo, he said warmly. Then he turned back to Dami. I want to help you. You've been through so much, but you've shown incredible strength. I believe you deserve a better life. Dami's eyes widened. Me? She asked, barely believing her ears.